In the state of California, there are 272,485 Arabic speakers in the state of California. There are only 7 Arabic translators, interpreters in the state of California. Why do you think that's important? Well, if you as a lawyer are dealing with the Arabic language, any of them from any of the countries, you better know that you can't get an interpreter just because you want one. Pick up the phone and say, I need an Arab interpreter for tomorrow. They're not around. You need to understand that it's not that easy to get interpreters, translators, when there's so few of them. All right, let's move on to translations and interpretations. Translation is the written word. Interpreting is the spoken word. Now, they're interchangeable from a general colloquialism. If I said something you don't understand me, you can say, would you translate that for me? I didn't understand what you said. So here I am telling you that translation is written and interpretation is oral. But if I say something and you say, translate it for me, it's going to be oral. But in the business of interpreting and translations, do understand that when you need a written document translated, you're not asking for it to be interpreted. Written is translation, oral is interpreting. Some of interpreters and translators have the skill set to do either, but the skill set is different, and not that many are able to accomplish that. So let's talk about skill sets for a moment. Skill sets. Translators, attention to detail, knowledge of the use of words in the subject language, precise translation to the language being translated, and understanding of the nuances of both languages, the lingo, and expertise in the specialized field. So if you have a document, let's say, that comes in from for patent, and the patent is for chemical engineering or drugs or whatever the case may be, you need to have a translator who knows the language of that industry. Because otherwise, if you were just speaking English and you didn't know the language of the industry that you're talking about, you're not going to be overly impressive in trying to explain what's going on. Interpreters. Gestures, precise conversion to the language, and basically translation and interpreting is the precise translation from the one language to another. The interpreter has to be knowledgeable in colloquialism, dialects, body language, hand gestures, tone of voice. And then I asked myself in preparing this, in doing this research, really? Do we want an interpreter to start interpreting, if you will, the hand gestures, the tone of voice of the deponent? I don't think so. I don't think it's good practice, and we don't allow our interpreting folks to do that because the person is being asked a question. So, did you and your wife have any problems? And he says, oh, God, we had so many problems, I can't take it anymore. Now, you want the interpreter to simply say, we've had so many problems, we couldn't take it anymore. You don't want the interpreter to interpret that person's words by saying, we had so many problems, and to try to imitate the way that person is speaking. You don't want that because then the interpreter is putting his own interpretation on the person who is simply trying to converse in their language. Okay, so in this nuts and bolts, the next thing is to understand whether interpreter proficiency levels, the certification process. Now, there is a certification process, just like for lawyers. You pass the bar, and then there's an MCLE course that you have to keep taking, 30 a year, 30 every 2 years or 3 years, and you continue to be, can able to practice law. There are 3 levels of certification. 1, administrative certified interpreters. Administrative means, for the moment, being able to interpret for workers' comp only. Then there's court-certified interpreters. And court-certified interpreters can do workers' comp and in any court in the state of California. Then there's federal certified interpreters, and they can do anything, including in federal court, or federal, any kind of translations or interpreting. Now, don't think for a second that just because they're federal that they are more highly qualified. They could be just as qualified, but they decided to take the exam for the federal. Do I hear a hand out in the audience? Please, Charlie.
Yes, Barry. My question to you is, two lawyers, as an example, end up in federal court with a case. Do they jointly decide on the interpreter they're going to use?
Well, it depends, just like a mediator or something. But if you have a client that is in federal court, and it's your client, and you need to be able to present that person's testimony, that's your call. And you get your interpreter to take care of that. That's not something that the two. Every so often there is something like an expert witness or something that the lawyers have agreed upon, and they'll split the cost of the interpreter. But in most cases, it's one lawyer's decision. What documents, this thing here is interpreter proficiency levels, legal documents. Now, the rubric would be fairly simple. Any document that you need translated or interpreted, any document you need translated, you're going to need an interpreter unless you know it. Now, you can interpret it. If you speak Russian or you speak Spanish, you can interpret it. However, if that document is going to be used for evidentiary purposes or in court, if the language is certifiable, and I'll get to that in a few moments, it then has to be done by a certified interpreter or translator. But basically, identity, financial documents, reports, transcripts, rulings from other countries, witness statement, anything. And I've heard something to the effect that in the state of California, that if your client, a new client, doesn't speak English really well, and they're proficient in French, Russian, your retainer agreement, the lawyer's retainer agreement, should be in the language that that person totally understands. So there's no misunderstanding down the road. When and why to utilize interpreters? Well, the when is fairly simple. When you have a client that doesn't speak English. An intake, new client. Clients from India, they only speak one of the languages in India. Well, you're going to need an interpreter for that meeting. During depositions and testimonies and trials, you're going to need an interpreter. And if it's for trials and in court, that interpreter must be certified. And on a very practical note, if you're practicing law in any way, wanting to expand your business to the global market, and the only language that you speak is English, well, I think you have one arm tied behind your back, because those who do not speak English are not going to be knocking at your door because you can't communicate with them. Globalization, the legal practice is getting global in nature. And whether you're practicing family law certainly immigration, certainly personal injury. You never know who the plaintiff is. You want to reach out to a market that you haven't reached out to before. You should be able to have the resources to speak their language. Let's talk about Google for a moment. A number of people have asked me, well, I get a translation. Why can't I just give it to Google? And okay, the answer is you can. And Google will give you enough of a translation that you will understand what it says. But it's not going to be admissible into court. So if you get a letter from a client from another country and he says, I need a lawyer, and they write it all out in that language, run it through Google, save yourself a few bucks, run it through Google, see what it's all about, and if it's something that you can handle, then you better start getting to make sure that you answer it properly and send back a response in that language that the original letter was written in.